Today's guest is the long-awaited Stuart Ray Sarbacker of the Tracing the Path of Yoga, the history of Indian mind-body disciplines, and Samadhi, the Numinous and the Sassative in Indo-Tibetan yoga. Both excellent books, and I've read them. Actually, I have to say, maybe embarrassingly so, I've read them a couple of times, not just because I was talking to you, Stuart. So I'm really happy to have you here today. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I was just asking a question that actually I think our audience might be interested in, that you'd actually have a bit of a history practicing Ashtanga Yoga, it turns out.
Yeah, I came to the academic study of yoga in part through my interest in the practice of yoga. And that's been a kind of consistent dynamic throughout my life, throughout my career, is sort of one hat, which is the more scholar of Indian philosophy and Sanskrit language and literature. And on the other hand, a serious and continuous practice of yoga, and both postural yoga as well as meditative practices. And with Ashtanga in particular, I came to that in the early 2000s, in part as I was working towards getting certification with the thought that in the long run, it would be great to teach an academic course that had yoga practice in it, which I actually do somewhat regularly now. And the way I got into Ashtanga actually was I had taken a Vinyasa yoga workshop and training with Shiva Ray, very famous California-based Vinyasa teacher. And at a certain point, she talked about her experience actually in Ashtanga yoga. And the sort of lights all went on for me that, so much of her Vinyasa practice was built on that Ashtanga foundation. And the next thing I knew, I had signed up for an Ashtanga yoga training with Manju Joyce, who visited Chicago, where I was living at the time, regularly through a place called the Chicago Yoga Center, run by a teacher named Sudha Wexler. And so for about 3-4 years, he would come in each year and I would take a kind of extended workshop and teacher training with him, and then practice locally at the studios. And so I was, doing a pretty serious, a couple of hours of Ashtanga practice every day for a pretty sustained period of time. And it was very transformative. And I really look back at that period as formative, both for my own personal yoga practice, and it gave me a lot of insights into the academic side of yoga. Eventually, I moved to Oregon to take a position at Oregon State University, and I moved to Eugene, where Kevin Freedom Kemple, who ultimately co-authored a book with me, ran the Eugene School of Yoga, again, very much in the kind of Mysore style of practice. And so I practiced there for a couple of years as well, before I moved from Eugene to Corvallis. So Ashtanga's been a big part of my own personal yoga narrative, and I still practice a Ashtanga-based yoga regularly, not as vigorously perhaps as I once practiced, but nonetheless, it's still really the foundation there.
I'm just thinking, I would hate to have you in my class, always saying all these things about yoga, and then you're in the background with all this knowledge of the yoga. You must have heard. I mean, being in yoga class, you must have heard a number of things where you think, yeah.
Well,
I'd like to question that teacher a little bit more on that statement or something.
That's always been an interesting part of the picture, and as a sort of scholar practitioner, you learn to negotiate those spaces.
Absolutely.
And, on one level, it really has informed my practice in important ways, bringing the sort of academic knowledge. But the practice space is a kind of different kind of space. But it's also led, to very fruitful sort of collaborations and conversations. The 8 Limbs of Yoga, the book I wrote with Freedom, that book really came out of me being in his class, listening to him talk about yoga philosophy, and then thinking, you know what, it would be really interesting to work together to turn this into a kind of formal conversation where, perhaps as you're suggesting, the ideas that he was inspiring, I could actually have a conversation with him about those things. And that's really the way that book worked out. Was we sat down regularly together and kind of went through the yoga philosophy of Patanjali in a kind of conversational style, just sort of back and forth. This is what I get when I read this. This is what I get. How can we negotiate and integrate these things? It was really just one of the highlights of my career, actually, as a scholar, author, and a yoga practitioner, was to have that dialogue over and around yoga philosophy. Yeah.
So to go back to the first book that I read, which is the Tracing the Path, and to get you back on track in terms of the more scholarship aspect of the conversation.
Sure.
What about the definition of yoga? You offer a number of definitions, which I kind of quite enjoyed. So I think no better place to start than the start. Do you have anything to add to?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the, I really looked at the book as a kind of a pragmatic and heuristic kind of educational tool, that would at least get conversations started, even if ultimately the reader, challenges my, approach to defining yoga, or the history of yoga for that matter. But one of the things I really wanted to emphasize there was sort of yoga as a praxis, as this sort of mind-body discipline, which then leads to these enhanced, abilities. I think I expressed it in terms of this sort of the perfection of human capacities, and that perfection has a kind of ambiguity. It can be dedicated towards a kind of enhanced ability to know and act in the world, but it can also be a means for kind of disentangling oneself from the world. And then in addition to that it can refer not only to that practice, but ultimately the goal that results from that. I kind of found that kind of frame very satisfying in terms of looking at the larger arc of yoga. So, I think that kind of way of thinking about yoga is applicable to, say, classical, yoga from the early centuries of the Common Era, and to the way that yoga is practiced in studios, around the world today. That, one's disciplining one's mind and one's body, and out of that comes a kind of enhancement to the physical, the mental faculties, as well as, in some cases, a kind of way to disentangle oneself from, the kind of pain and misery associated with embodied existence. And then, of course, secondarily, it comes to mean a mode of practice associated with some particular teacher or some particular tradition. So it might be something like Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-limbed kind of formalized 8-limbed set of yoga, or it might be Iyengar Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga, which refers to, in one case, a particular teacher, in another case, a particular lineage, let's say, of teachers.
And often the word that crops up with this is tapas. And you mentioned that the modern class actually is quite affiliated to this idea of tapas in yoga. If we're looking at what people are doing in the modern realm, it does seem like a kind of kind of punitive discipline. And you also kind of consider that they get into the kind of the roots of yoga and the Brahmanical and shamanic roots that you mentioned a great deal in your book, which I really enjoyed. That seems to be a juncture between the kind of Vedic ideas and the outliers, these shamanic people doing their own thing in the forest or the cave that perhaps gave rise to the roots of yoga as we know today. So maybe might give a little something on that, if you would.
Yeah. Well, tapas is such a fascinating and interesting topic. I think integrally connected on so many levels with the development of yoga. And as you were saying, I mean, one thread goes through these sort of priestly Brahminical traditions in which one disciplined oneself as a preparation for, among other things, the performance of ritual. And that might have been fasting. It included, at least at some stage, breath control, different ways to purify oneself, in part through the kind of friction generated through the process of self-denial. And in fact, tapas literally means heat. And I think it's useful to think about it in terms of the kind of inner friction generated when, let's say, one denies oneself certain things or subjects oneself to others. And that becomes, as I'm sure you're aware, part of the more systematic tradition of yoga later. Tapas is integrated both in the classical context, both in terms of what's called Kriya Yoga, which includes tapas, swadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana, as well as one of the niyamas, that tapas becomes a vehicle for the purification of the mind and the senses, and presumably certain powers and capacities.
You're suggesting that they're perhaps separate in Patanjali then? That Patanjali's Ashtanga is a separate thing to the Kriya Yoga?
I think they're integrally related, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about what is the relationship between the two of those. And I know there have been theories that have suggested that this reflects the compilation of multiple perspectives on yoga within the context of the Yoga Sutra, the Yoga Shastra. They're clearly on a similar level in the sense of, I think they're whether you think about it in terms of those three, or you think about it in terms of being within the eight, they're both fulfilling very similar functions. So tapas, swadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana appear as elements of the niyamas, and so they're kind of put within the eight limb system. So you could say that for some reason they are being highlighted as being special, or one might think of them as a kind of alternative to the eight-limbed method. I'd sort of lean maybe towards the former, to say that they're kind of very special. And in one analysis, it's because they refer to the successive purification of body, speech, and mind. So body through tapas, speech through swadhyaya, which refers to the kind of oral process of recitation. I mean, more generally, people say swadhyaya means self-study or self-application. And there's, I think, there's canonical support for saying that swadhyaya can be expressed in terms of, say, study of yogic texts. But again, if we link it back to its original context in the Vedic tradition, it referred principally to the recitation of mantras, or the performance of text orally. And then ishvara pranidhana, which in the case of the niyamas is said to be a kind of fast track to developing samadhi, this deep contemplation of mind. So purification of body, purification of speech, purification of mind. I often actually emphasize swadhyaya for my students, in part because I think here in the United States, we tend to kind of sideline oral culture. And I think there's something very powerful about vocally performing a text, reading a text with your eyes versus performing.
To memorize their homeworks and read them back to you.
In some cases, yeah. I mean, I definitely try to get the students to learn key terminology and be able to articulate that at least. But yeah, I mean, I do encourage them to either A, just simply read texts aloud, or B, memorize them. I mean, memorizing some of the Sanskrit literature around yoga was really critical for my own sort of experience and kind of coming to understand and absorb those texts.
I think, again, one part of the first book that I really loved was the fact of this understanding the kind of Brahmanical tradition and how it evolved to be something very different, more like what we know today. but it comes out of a very different roots, really. As you mentioned, recitation and mantra, and nothing to do with really certainly body practices or austerities, and even terms like karma, reincarnation, and things that we kind of feel are implicit in yoga philosophy now seem to come later in. So perhaps for our listeners, would you mind explaining a little bit of how the evolution happens from the Brahmanical side of things up to, say, the Buddhism and the shamanics? And also, there's a lot about this which is complicated, and I felt was quite difficult for me to understand, between the Vedic and the smarter Brahmanical traditions. So now I've got you. I can actually ask you. It's an incredible kind of privilege to actually ask you that to help me with that one in the book.
It's a privilege to be here, and I just respect you so much for your engagement. Both on the scholarly and the practitioner side. I mean, you've really created a space to have, these very, I think, important conversations about the linkages between, the kind of living traditions and these sort of deeper historical traditions. So,
Thanks.
So the feeling's mutual. I'm glad to be here. So yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and there's a lot to be said there. There's a lot on a certain level to not be said there, in the sense of what we know about the kind of development of yoga traditions is somewhat contingent, and dependent on the textual materials we have available, and to some degree, what we can reasonably speculate to fill in the gaps in our knowledge there. And that really applies not only to the ancient materials, but even to, say, the later classical and medieval traditions of yoga, where we've got some very representative texts that tell us a lot, but presumably there were a lot of other things out there. And who knows, in some cases, we may even find additional materials in the coming years, and come to completely new understandings. I know you've talked with both Jim Mallinson and Jason Birch, for example, who've just been absolute pioneers in really tracing the genealogies of yoga, in part through this kind of deep manuscript work, almost archaeological work, of finding these linkages or finding texts that completely, in some cases, change our understanding of the development of yoga. So to some extent, we can say some, I think, very concrete things, but I think it's important also to have some humility in recognizing that, the ground we're on may shift over time. I mean, the way I think about, say, especially the formation of the early traditions of yoga, was one, you have this Vedic tradition, what might be just sort of generally referred to as the early sort of stages of what we now refer to as the Hindu tradition, in which you had a priestly class that performed rituals. And around those rituals was a culture of initiation, which, sort of the kind of progenitor of the guru-disciple relationship, where you have a teacher, often a parent, passing on knowledge to their children, especially to their male sons, principally through an oral form, as opposed to textual, which came later. And in association with that, the idea that a student of the Vedas cultivated a particular lifestyle, which included things like the practice of celibacy, a certain amount of self-disciplining, which probably included things like fasting, and perhaps purificatory practices related to the breath, etc. All building up to a kind of ritual mastery, which involves performing ritual actions, making offerings, and reciting mantras. There's also this other element of the ritual consumption of a sacred beverage called soma, which clearly led to some state of exhilaration. There's considerable debate over whether it was a sort of psychedelic kind of substance or just something like a stimulant like ephedra. But you got this kind of religious
And
complex.
I mean, just now break that up and just reference your conversation with Daniel Simpson on Daniel Simpson's podcast. God, I can't remember the name of it. Living history, something. But an excellent podcast where you on Daniel Simpson's podcast you do speak in depth about this summer. So I think everyone definitely go over there and listen to Daniel's conversation with you on that further. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. I believe it's called Ancient Futures.
Ancient Futures.
Ancient Futures. Yep.
You got it.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed my conversation with Daniel there. To make a long story short, clearly there were a set of practices that were kind of what I call proto-yoga in nature, which includes things like the control of body and breath, using tapas or a kind of ascetic discipline, self-denial, or even self-mortification as a kind of enhancer of religious performance. There was accessing of visionary states of being and other kinds of factors that end up being like building blocks, at least conceptually, if not also pragmatically, of later yoga traditions. But then at the same time, around the 5th, 6th century BCE, of the emergence of Buddhism, Jainism, and what are more broadly called the Shramana traditions, which out of which came additional building blocks for more systematic later traditions of yoga. And it included an emphasis on the cyclical worldview. And, it may well have, again, there's a lot of debate about whether that cyclical worldview appeared within the Vedic tradition around the same time as Buddhism and Jainism, or if Buddhism and Jainism contributed that to Vedic and Hindu culture. But in any case, you have the emergence of this cyclical worldview, and you have the emergence of formal disciplines of body and mind. So the Jains take tapas to its limit. In fact, some of the Jain texts talk about how superior their particular methods of tapas are to what were clearly existing methods within the Vedic tradition. And likewise, the Buddhist tradition...
Starving yourself to death is certainly fairly good tapas, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taken to the nth degree. Yeah.
I mean, that is the furthest edge of it. And of course, in Buddhism, the story of the Buddha includes him nearly fasting himself to death and deciding that it's not the way to go, which is, on one level, an expression of a key, Buddhist principle, the middle way. But it's also a very explicit rejection of the Jain ascetic path and the idea that it's somehow valuable to fast to that sort of ultimate limit. And so one of the traditions I've studied the most extensively, of course, is the sort of classical tradition of yoga, Patanjali Yoga, the Yoga Sutra, or Yoga Shastra. And one of the things you see there is clearly an attempt to systematize and integrate not only these practices that come out of the Vedic tradition, but also Jain and Buddhist ideas. And so one of, if not the most formative expressions of yoga, is doing the work of kind of collating these practices and bringing them together and trying to kind of create a coherent idea of what yoga practice is. And so the 5 yamas, for example, are pretty much identical with the Jain Mahavrata. In fact, Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra uses the word Mahavrata, or the great vow. Likewise, the kind of schema for meditative practice in Patanjali seems very much parallel to what you see developed in the Buddhist traditions as well. Or even things like the so-called 5 spiritual faculties, Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, and Prajna. I mean, that formulation is extremely common in Buddhist literature. And so whether they share these ideas, whether they were kind of taking them from each other, clearly in that post-Vedic period, these ideas get consolidated. And so let me just finish, though, by addressing your point about sort of the difference between, say, the Vaidika or Vedic Brahmin and the Smarta Brahmana, or the priest of the so-called remembered tradition. So this is, I think, a useful distinction for actually thinking about the classical yoga tradition, because that emerged during a period of kind of reconsolidation of the priestly traditions in the Smarta period, in the early centuries of the Common Era. And basically what had happened was, in the previous era, you had the Vedic tradition, the priestly tradition, focused around fire sacrifice rituals and the articulation of the kind of ideology for that society. Over time, Buddhist and Jain traditions became dominant. And then around the turn of the first millennium, there was a kind of resurgence of priestly thought and culture. And part of that resurgence of priestly thought and culture was kind of rebuilding the priestly traditions. And there was a shift in focus. So instead of doing these big fire sacrifices, now the priests were largely performing domestic rituals and rituals like puja, of worship in temples and in homes. The other part of it was they were consolidating all of these stories of the gods and goddesses. They were also consolidating these various practices. And so one way to look at Patanjali's yoga is a product of this new generation of priestly practitioners who sought to kind of create a big picture of what religious practice was about. And in the case of Patanjali, yoga in particular. And not only did that draw from that earlier Vedic tradition, but it also drew from both Jain and Buddhist and perhaps other traditions that existed at that time. So I really see that kind of, Smarta context as a shift from this earlier mode of priestly practice to the new mode, which to some extent is the mode that continues to be the kind of central expression of priestly life in Hinduism today.
Thank you. You just about did that. Well done.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. No, I do understand it now. It was a point in the book that I wasn't quite clear about, but it seemed to be important. So I wanted you to answer that for me personally. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just going to say one last example is in the Vedic context, you had what's sometimes referred to as the classical pantheon of 33 deities with Indra at its head. And in the classical period, the Smarta period, you have the emergence of Shiva, Vishnu, and the goddess as the sort of principal objects of worship and devotion to. And that's a major shift. And Indra and others still have roles to play, but they're kind of in the background. They're supporting kind of actors in the divine drama.
Where would that have happened, roughly, in time period, this kind of reappraisal of Brahmanism? What?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, I think, a topic of considerable debate and dispute. But I would say point to this era of the early centuries of the Common Era, where you had some shifting political dynamics that in part were affecting, I think, the patronage of different traditions, as well as I think the consolidation of narratives like the Indian epics, famously the Bhagavad Gita, and some of the late Upanishads that sought to kind of really tie things together.
I'm going to take an abrupt kind of side step now and
Sure.
ask you, as is often the case for people ask me, what, on a basic level for people, what is the difference, or what should we look out for between yoga and Buddhism to differentiate the two from one another? Because I think people often get tied up with confusing the one to the other, really. And also, that in many sort of respects, Buddhism is somewhat more of a pragmatic practice to segue into modern yoga than the yoga tradition is.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of points, I think, of connection. And, one of them that I've explored at length is this idea of, the value and the virtue of disciplining the mind and the body. And so those, both the Hindu and Buddhist traditions share a kind of legacy of, principles and practices built around the idea that when you discipline the mind and the body, there are all sorts of valuable things that come about. And so there are definitely deep connections there. They both share this cyclical worldview, but they disagree on some key elements of it. So from the Buddhist perspective, there's often an emphasis on the idea that of impermanence, and the idea that birth and rebirth is not just a kind of movement of the same self from life to life, but is continually a process of transformation. One way to look at it is that there's a view that there's continuity, but not identity. I am continuous as a person today with who I was yesterday, and the person I am tomorrow is continuous with me now. But there's no essential meanness that, or I that goes through this. Whereas I think the Hindu tradition tends to view the self more in terms of a substantive, persisting self that moves from body to body, sort of just changing the outer covering, but remaining the same within. And so one way to look at it is Buddhists tend to focus more on process, and the Hindu philosophical traditions focus more on substance. Who I am as a process versus who I am as a substance. Nonetheless, I think both traditions have at least a thread that agrees on the idea that we're caught up in this cycle of birth and rebirth, and that through kind of skillful self-development, through deep insight, we can overcome the kind of attachment and affliction, etc., associated with embodied existence. I mean, one thing to keep in mind too is I think Buddhism as a tradition, in the study of religion, for example, we talk about Buddhism as a universalizing tradition, that its notions of truth and reality, are seen to be independent of one's particular situation or location in the world. So anyone in principle can become a Buddhist, because being Buddhist is not a function of your conditions that you're in, but they're a function of a kind of pervasive reality. Whereas Hinduism, it tends towards what some people call voluntary, or not voluntary, a naturalizing mode of religious practice, where your identity in part is a function of who you are and where you're born. And this is perhaps most profoundly expressed in terms of things like class or caste, varna or jati, that you're born into a particular place, and that in part is a key element of the idea of whether you're a Hindu practitioner or not. And so, for example, one might ask the question, if you ask the question, are you a Hindu? One answer to that is, were you born into a Hindu family? Whereas, are you a Buddhist might be a question of whether you've committed in faith to becoming part of the Buddhist community. Now, of course, that distinction can collapse at times where, if I'm born into a Buddhist family, I'm probably more likely to be Buddhist, whether I've chosen it or not. And likewise, in terms of Hindu practice, I think you see examples where that boundary gets a little bit more fuzzy. So, for example, the ISKCON movement, sort of colloquially referred to as the Hare Krishna movement, I think identifies in the contemporary context as Hindu in practice. And I think you see among the ISKCON communities, people who generationally speaking were not born into Hindu families, who have taken on a Hindu identity and have been accepted by the more sort of South Asian based Hindu traditions. So there are exceptions, let's say, to every rule. But I think, because of its at least claim to universality, I think Buddhism, tends to be viewed as compatible with a pluralistic religious identity. So, for example, in the U.S., there's a kind of very prominent community of Buddhists who identify as both Buddhist and Jewish at the same time. That's in part because there's this idea that you don't necessarily have to give up your, spiritual or religious identity to be part of the Buddhist community. You can just learn Buddhist philosophy or practice Buddhist meditation. And so I think that gives rise to some of this sense of accessibility. I'm just going to do mindfulness. I don't need to convert to Buddhism to do that.
Have you considered how you mentioned the excellent qualification of process and substance, how that might relate to modern asana practice? If you pose that question, because certainly the idea of substance or reducing yourself down to an inherent substance, and also then what you might do with that in terms of relating it outwards to God, some other kind of like an entity, and then the Buddhist tradition, which is much more based on seeing oneself as a continuous process, meditation, which we don't see so much in the yoga tradition. Yeah, I mean, I did kind of circle around the possibility that in many respects, ideas of Buddhist practice might go quite nicely with asana, where much of the yoga stuff, the Samkhya kind of trying to kind of reduce ourselves and wall ourselves off as this kind of monad, in the modern context, might not be actually relevant or appropriate to most people's experience of reality or how they'd like to experience themselves in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you do see some kind of, high profile yoga teachers. Richard Freeman, for example, I think is someone who's had a long-standing interest in Vipassana meditation. Or Cindy Lee, I think, is another teacher who sought to really incorporate, that have viewed this kind of, mindfulness or insight type of practice as being something that's quite useful for someone doing a kind of postural yoga practice, because it's really rooted in this kind of moment-to-moment awareness of, what's happening in the mind and the body. And so I think, I think anyone who practices yoga, I think in some serious way, I think comes to these sorts of things almost naturally, that this kind of ability to, in a sort of state, in a kind of mental state of equanimity, observe what's happening in the mind and body without feeling the need to react to it or respond to it, constantly, or even recognizing at moments your unconscious impulses to do things and being able to not respond to what otherwise would have, made you act in a particular way. And so, one way of looking at that is to say that, what both Buddhism and yoga traditions share is, this desire to be more attuned to and aware of what's happening in the mind and the body. And so, traditions like Vipassana really embody that Buddhist emphasis on being able to develop equanimity no matter what's happening. And really, in principle, the idea that it's liberating to do that, to be able to experience things without that kind of reactivity kind of dominating your experience. On the other hand, I mean, I think, part of the appeal of, I think, the more Hindu perspective, comes out of, I think, this sort of experience that I think many people have through yoga of something that is just beyond their ordinary experience or awareness. I've had students say to me, after I practice, you know, you know, uh, my postural yoga, when I'm sitting in shavasana, there's a kind of peace I experience there that's unlike anything else in my life. There's something deeper going on there that is, very unique. And I think that leads, on a certain level to, view yoga as tapping into something extraordinary or sacred that's set apart from, our ordinary lives. And I think that's a doorway to, a deeper, more kind of spiritual vision of what yoga is. Actually years ago, when I was doing my yoga training, I took a yoga anatomy class with Paul Grilly. And it was a yin yoga teacher, and just was perhaps one of the best yoga classes I've had in terms of thinking about the rootedness of yoga in the sort of givenness of our mind and mental and physical conditions. And Paul had a way of sort of really sort of bringing things down to earth in terms of let me just give one example. So he was very fascinated by BKS Iyengar, and Iyengar in particular as writ large in terms of light on yoga. And so he talked about how Iyengar illustrates in those postures this kind of mastery of yoga, which the postural side of yoga, which is infrequently, if ever, paralleled in terms of the sheer variations of poses that he could perform. And Grilly said, is this because he's just a super disciplined practitioner? Well, clearly he is a super disciplined practitioner. But what Grilly wanted to argue was, I could be a super disciplined practitioner, but that doesn't mean I could do what Iyengar does. And his theory was that he was just sort of physically predisposed in a way to have this kind of level of and range of mobility that was just truly extraordinary in all these different planes. And, one way to think about that is, I think many yoga practitioners have had the experience. You're in a yoga class, you do one posture and you're really deep in there, and, everyone's, or others are looking at you as like, wow, this person's really deep in this pose. And then there's a different pose, and then suddenly you're struggling and other people are very deep in that pose, sort of getting at the way in which, maybe my hip rotates this way really well, maybe, and their hip rotates the other way. Whereas Iyengar, his hip rotates all of those different ways. And so there's a degree to which that foundation is there. He also told the story about how he met a contortionist from Cirque du Soleil. And he said, how long did it take you to, learn how to do all of these things that you do? And apparently the person told him, well, actually, I was working at a publishing house doing a desk job, and a book about contortionism came across my desk. And I picked it up and looked at it and thought, I'm kind of a bendy person. Took it home that night and did every single contortionist pose in that book. And so the moral of the story is that ultimately it wasn't this person's years of effort that got them there, but it was, these predispositions. And presumably if they're in Cirque du Soleil, they are going to need to discipline themselves to avoid injury and be strong and etc. But that, there's a lot that's given. That being said, one of the things I think I would like personally to explore more about Iyengar in particular was the notion of that through yoga asana, you can tap into some kind of deep intelligence of the body. That we all have this kind of nascent capacity to really plug into the body. That the body can be a vehicle for awakening something very deep inside of us that is the key to not only perhaps our embodiment, but the key to life. And one person once asked, you're teaching all these postures. What about all the other limbs of yoga? And he said, well, all of the limbs of yoga can be found in the context of postural practice. I think in Yoga Mala, Patabi Joy says something about when you get all of these sorts of things in alignment, you flood towards the self. And in both cases, there's expressing this idea that using that kind of inner intelligence through these variety of practices, you can awaken something very powerful inside of you. And again, I think the boundary between just this is in my mind to this being a kind of spiritual faculty becomes very fluid there. That there's a kind of a deeper element that is to be found through that practice. And again, I think that aligns, with this more substantive view that there's something to be found there that's extremely special.
Okay, so how shall I phrase this? To carry on from there then, and to finish our conversation, I wanted to go briefly onto that first book that I read of yours, which was the Samadhi book, which I really loved because we don't often hear the goals talked about, right? You talked about Iyengar and Patabi Joyce talking about this, they're contextualizing the asana experience and what that might mean. But, in the modern context of a class situation, you don't really hear people say what they're aiming for, funnily enough, right? And I think that book really did a great service to kind of laying out the possibilities there, right? I mean, you mentioned, and I'd like you to go through these now, the differentiation between the Sassative and the Numinous, the cathexic and the cathartic. And I think there was one more definition that you offered, kind of polarities to as well. But I wonder if you could just conclude with just giving a little whistle-stop tour through that book, because I think it's a really important, I mean, both books I love, but I think that book is really unique. I've not seen anything else like that, around at all. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And one of the things that that really I've come to sort of appreciate out of that project over time is that it both addresses issues in terms of the history and philosophy of yoga and its longer arc, but also has, in my opinion at least, a lot of relevance to issues and debates around the contemporary practice of yoga. And in a nutshell, I mean, the idea that I explored in the book was how the cultivation of deep meditative states is expressed in the narrative and philosophical literature, not only of the Hindu tradition, but you also see this in the Buddhist and Jain traditions. That when the idea being that when you discipline your mind through meditative practice and enter these deeper states of contemplation, it yields the ability to achieve states that are quite akin to what one might refer to as the powers and capacities of beings in higher cosmological realms. And Numinous here, I'm drawing from a line of academic scholarship in terms of using it as a category to talk about religious experience. But essentially what it refers to is the idea of becoming like a Numen, which is the Latin term, like a spirit. And so, and one of the ways this is expressed in the Indian tradition is that when you develop this deep concentration, it's as if your mind is entering into the cosmological realms that are associated with beings of kind of higher spiritual order, which possess, enhanced abilities and capacities. And that is expressed in part through the idea of siddhi, of extraordinary accomplishments or perfections, which include things like the ability to see near and far or hear distant things, to read other people's minds, to become invisible, etc., to fly through the air, which I'm sure you recognize and your listeners recognize are sort of the kinds of capacities we associate with divine beings. And so the point being that when one's mind becomes very powerful through meditation, it's like the boundary between the human and the divine starts to break down or dissolve. And there are actually all sorts of interesting narratives of where yogis or ascetics become very powerful, so much so that the gods get kind of nervous about this. In fact, the Enlightenment story of the Buddha kind of revolves around this trope where a particular god of desire and death becomes very agitated and upset because he realizes that the Buddha, through his meditative practice, is sort of threatening this cosmic order. So the flip side of that is what I call the sassative aspect, which is the idea that you're not accomplishing more powers or abilities that are relative to the world, but instead developing a kind of detachment and a freedom that draws one out of the kind of the pain and misery associated with embodied existence. And so in the case of the cessative principle, the goal is often, moksha or nirvana, moksha meaning release, or nirvana meaning something like to be extinguished. And so that part of the dynamic, we associate, I think, with wisdom and insight, where you begin to understand or come to understand the way that the world works on a very deep and subtle level, such that you're no longer bound up or driven by those factors. And I think a microcosm of that is, the example I gave earlier about how when I'm in yoga asana practice, I may have, a particular motivation to, say, move arise, but I'm going to acknowledge that that's there and I'm going to let it kind of come and go and pass. That kind of notion on a very deep, subtle level, connects to the idea that when one develops a kind of equanimity to observe the flow of experience without grasping onto it, without reacting either by attaching oneself to it or pulling oneself away, that eventually blossoms into this state of freedom or liberation. And so these two elements, the numinous and sassative, represent different expressions of that kind of yogic mastery of mind characterized by samadhi. Samadhi literally means to sort of place together, or some people define it as coherence. But I think the key idea that I have seen expressed is that when you develop deep attention for long enough, it's like that becomes a force on its own. A mind that keeps being trained to come back to the same place again and again becomes a very powerful, a very concentrated mind that's capable of really, truly extraordinary things. And just to sort of throw a couple of anecdotes in this, I mentioned earlier that I practiced Ashtanga Yoga pretty seriously for a number of years. And I remember during one period where I was practicing, a couple of hours a day very seriously, feel like I began to kind of see the way that energy moved in my body in a very kind of powerful and intuitive way. And not only that, it seemed like when I was out walking on the street, I could look at someone else and almost see the way energy was in their body. And I'm not sure if it was just sort of a perception of the way that people were carrying their body, but this very acute sense of like the nature and sort of construction and movement of my own body and of others. And I would say as my level of intensity of practice decreased, I became less attuned to that. But I feel like if I really kind of pay attention to it and kind of draw my memory back to it, I can kind of evoke that a bit. Another example is I went through a period where I was practicing some very serious, sustained practice of a Buddhist practice called samatha or shamatha, which is a practice where you develop a kind of deep focus on one object. Often people use the breath. And I had a series of experiences of just experiencing a kind of very deep and powerful and very kind of sublime level of serenity in those experiences, coming out of it and sort of feeling on one level like my mind was so focused, no matter what I would turn my mind to, I felt like, I could do this. The other thing was this sense of like, for, a day or sometimes even weeks, a kind of serenity where things that would normally upset or bother me did not make a dent at all. And so I can't claim to have flown or have read other people's minds, but I can definitely say through my own anecdotal experience, the force of that concentration and the confidence and sometimes the kind of sense of enhanced perception gives me some degree of, willingness to entertain that these things
it's
are
no
possible.
second. Yeah, if not flying, then feeling a little bit more equanimous. Yeah, we'll take that. Yeah.
Well, and it's funny. I was joking with one of my yoga scholar buddies who practiced some yoga, perhaps not Ashtanga. I said, when you were seriously practicing yoga, do you ever have the feeling where you could just like maybe step off the ground and fly? And he said, no, I haven't. And I said, well, there's a thing when you're doing Uddiyana Bandha a lot, when you're really kind of engaging that Bandha practice, especially if you're doing, a pretty serious practice day after day, you feel that lift. And I remember just, when I was really seriously practicing, just feeling, a lightness on my feet as if I could take off,
That's
at any moment.
Not at all the conversation I was expecting to have with you, but but great, great. I mean, it just shows your kind of dexterity between, I think which makes your work unique is you do move between, the realms of being, an academic, but also being, very obviously it comes from a passion to explore yoga yourself personally.
Yeah, and I don't
I know.
claim to have any sort of extraordinary powers or anything like that, but it's more sort of anecdotes to say like I think there's an experiential dimension that someone with at least a minor exposure to yoga is perhaps going to be able to identify with, and that goes to on one level. This dynamic between the numinous and the sassative is played out historically in terms of a tension in the yoga tradition between pursuing yoga for the achievement of these powers and abilities. In fact, some people would even say the inclusion of these long laundry lists of yogic powers was a kind of rhetorical hook to get people to practice this because these practices promised these extraordinary achievements, versus pursuing the practice of yogic discipline for the sake of liberation, for becoming a better or more ethical person, etc. These two things have been historically in tension with one another. When we look at the contemporary context, there are people who are ready to sort of write off a lot of yoga as not true or not authentic yoga because people's motivations aren't focused on spiritual liberation or becoming a better person, because it's about beautification or just physically feeling better or looking stronger. And my response to that is, if you look at contemporary yoga in the context of the larger history of yoga, in which there's been a tension between these sorts of worldly aims and otherworldly aims,
Yeah.
what we're seeing is not an aberration. In fact,
Exactly.
it's an extension of what we see in the history of yoga, that yoga can be used for various purposes. And again, I'm sure you've seen the movie Enlighten Up, which is such a great documentary about modern yoga and really, is a snapshot of a particularly important moment, I think, in yoga's history globally. And at one point, Iyengar says to this, to the one of the main sort of figures in the film, he says, yoga's open both ways. If you want it for personal development, it's there for you. If you want it for something more, it's there for you too. It's your choice. It's up to you. And I thought that was just such an sort of insightful illustration of at least Iyengar's sense that yoga can be used for sort of personal purposes, for a kind of edge in the world, and or it can be used to explore more, let's say, ethical, spiritual, etc. types of goals.
Or both at the same time. Thanks, Stuart. That's a wonderful chat. I know you're working on psychedelics now as well. Is there any book coming out to watch out for soon?
Yeah, so I just put a proposal in for a kind of follow-up to Tracing the Path of Yoga called Tracing the Path of Soma.
Okay.
Psychoactives and Psychedelics in the History and Philosophy of Yoga. And the goal there is to kind of build on the work in Tracing the Path of Yoga, where I found at several junctures, I thought, someone really needs to look more deeply at the relationship between yoga and the use of psychoactive substances.
Oh, wow.
And at a certain point, I realized, why don't I do it?
Sounds
Maybe
exciting. Couple
this
of
is
years.
a task to take up. Yeah.
How long do you think it'll take you? I mean, you're very, very methodical, and the work you do. So, I mean, that's going to be great. Next year or the year after?
Thank you. I'm hoping to research and write the book over about the next year to year and a half. So, we'll see.
We'll see you then. We'll see you back then, I hope. Okay.
Great.
Well, thanks for your time. Really appreciated it. And I'm sure everyone listening will too. So please comment if you have any questions, and I'll get back to you or refer you to Stuart. Thanks, Stuart. Read the books, guys. Both those books. I know you've wrote other books, Stuart. I'm sorry. I didn't mention your other books, but those are the two I've read so far. And I really, really enjoy them. So I really suggest that everyone should read them. They're both very readable. And the Samadhi one, very unique. As I said, I've not had anything on that yet. So, and the Soma one, I think, is going to be covering youth charity as well. So thank you for your contribution to all of yoga scholarship and beyond, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Adam. Thanks so much for having me.